Welcome to Brainfluence. I'm Roger Dooley. I often use Amazon examples in my speeches and workshops, and the company is an early case study in my book, Friction. So today I'm excited to be joined by Colin Bryar. He joined Amazon way back in 1998 and spent the next 12 years as part of Amazon's senior leadership team. For 2 of those years, he was chief of staff to Jeff Bezos, also known as Jeff's Shadow. After Amazon, he served as chief operating officer of Singapore-based e-commerce company Redmart, later acquired by Alibaba. Colin is co-founder of Working Backwards, where he teaches how to implement Amazon-style management. His new book, strangely enough, is Working Backwards: Insights, Stories, and Secrets from Inside Amazon. Welcome to the show, Colin.
Oh, thanks for inviting me on the show, Roger.
Yeah, so explain, Colin, what it meant to be Jeff Bezos' shadow and what that experience was like.
Yeah, so I was very fortunate to have spent 2 years working with Jeff as his technical advisor or shadow. They called that role internally. And when Jeff first asked me if I would like to take the role, my first question was, well, what is it? What is this role, and what it's a success look like? Because I knew it was such an important role that I didn't want to take it if I didn't think I was the right person to help in that role. But the way that Jeff put it is that the first thing was to help him be a better CEO. So I worked a lot with teams who would be coming in to talk with Jeff, or afterwards, following up with teams after they had talked with Jeff. But he said the more important thing was a longer term part of the job. And he said, by the end of this tenure in the role, that we'd be able to model how each other thought about different issues, because I would go somewhere else in the company and work relatively autonomously. So I took that part to heart too, and I would take advantage of all the hallway, dead time and space, or if we're traveling and have a long list of questions, I'd keep peppering him with, and just really figure out how he thought about different issues. So really what it looked like, every day, during that time, he probably got in the office around 10 and left around 7. So, I'd bookend on either side of the day. And it wasn't just a technical role. So it was really being in the room and participating in everything that Jeff did for those, for those 2 years. So got to see a really good broad overview of the company, and then where Jeff spent his time. One of the questions that I often get from lots of CEOs, especially who are stepped into a big role, is like, how should I spend my day? And so, I really asked Jeff a lot of how a CEO spends his time is one of the most important decisions that you can make. And, Jeff gave me some good insights on how he viewed that, and then also how he wanted to scale the company so people could make decisions when he wasn't in the room that, he'd be happy with.
Mhm. After spending so much time working directly with Jeff, is there any particular superpower, or maybe are there a couple that you observe that he seems to have that other, even pretty good leaders that you've met haven't had?
Yeah, number one is the smarts. Just it's off the charts, and he's very humble about that too. He said that you really want to be proud of your actions, not your gifts, and having a high IQ is really just a gift. He just has that innately. But besides that, where he, I think, shines above most that I've been around is just customer obsession. He never compromises on that. His time horizon is much different. He thinks long term about things, and just that spirit of invention also shines through. And those 3 things are really contagious. And so one of the things that I learned is that long-term thinking doesn't necessarily mean it takes you longer to get to your goal. Often long-term thinking forces you to really focus on where you want to go, and you won't deviate off path, and you'll get there faster. And 2 examples of that are Amazon was the fastest company from a zero to $100 billion in revenue. And then AWS, if taken as a separate company, which didn't have any tailwinds really from Amazon, the e-commerce company when it started, grew from 0 to $10 billion faster than Amazon did. And that was really with long-term thinking. But so just the spirit of invention, long-term thinking, and customer obsession. And then it was interesting during the time I worked with them, and he even said, he learned how to become a better operator. There are lots of great operators at Amazon who are, operationally excellent, and taught Jeff a lot about that. Jeff Wilkie in particular was one of them. And so that was a teachable skill. Jeff is always curious on learning new things, and then taking those new ideas and incorporating them into Amazon.
Yeah, Colin, PowerPoint has a pretty, well, first of all, it's pretty much ubiquitous in corporate America. At the same time, it has kind of a bad reputation, to the point where death by PowerPoint is a thing. And usually that refers to boring slides that are filled with text, people putting up 50-line spreadsheets on a slide that nobody can read anything, and all these sort of misuses of PowerPoint. But Amazon banned PowerPoint from their, or at least many of their internal presentations, if not all, and not because they're so incredibly boring, but because it could be too persuasive. Explain that concept of how PowerPoint can actually be maybe a little bit too effective, but also why Amazon dropped it in favor of narratives, written narratives.
Yeah, Amazon dropped PowerPoint in favor of written narratives for decision-making meetings. So Amazon still uses PowerPoints for things like all hands, or when it's a one-to-many broadcasting, to a group. A VP gets in front of a group. But for decision-making forums where you're looking at a body of information, it was back in 2004, we were using PowerPoint just like everyone else. And we realized that as the business was getting complex, we weren't making the high quality decisions that we wanted to. And Jeff just said, okay, starting, and it was at his management team meetings. It was held once a week on Tuesdays. And it was a 4-hour meeting, and there were about 2 to 3 teams that would come in and present. And it was actually a Wednesday. I remember that day of the week, he said, okay, starting for next week, we're going to try narratives. And one thing that was notable is it was an experiment. We realized that PowerPoint wasn't really working for us, or slides. And we could have always gone back if the narrative idea didn't work. But Jeff has said later since called this move one of the best things that Amazon did. And where it removes bias really, and it removes the presentation bias. And you can have, for an example, is you can have a charismatic speaker who has a so-so idea or even a bad idea, and can convince a group or an organization to go forward with that, not maliciously, but it's just not a great idea. And a great presenter can convince a group of people. The flip side is you can have someone who has an awesome idea, but is just not a great presenter. It could be a boring presentation, and you may skip over something. And often when people ask about a slide presentation afterwards, well, how did it go? They say, oh, the presenter was really engaging, or the presentation was boring. But at the end of the day, customers don't really care how the meeting went in terms of the presentation. They care that the company took an idea and took an action that would make their lives better, either through creating a product or a feature and rolling out something that enhances their lives. And so Amazon switched to use narratives just because it can convey a lot more information in the same unit time, at least 10x. If you look at pixel density, it can handle the multi-causal relationships versus hierarchical slide. A presentation doesn't do that. And what it has allowed Amazon to do is the leaders stay connected to a broader range of businesses at a much deeper level. And if you go into it, spend an hour in a narrative meeting or an hour in a slide meeting, same hour, but you get about 10 times as much information. So on average, you're going to make better decisions with the former versus the latter. So those are a couple reasons that Amazon tried it. It was an experiment, and it worked so well that they continue to use it. And it wasn't just for Jeff's staff meetings. This is another example of, something's a good process when it's easy to implement, it's teachable, and then you don't really have to have huge auditing mechanisms to make sure it's being followed. Leaders at Amazon just realized this was a more effective decision-making tool for them than slides, and so they started adopting it on their own. And now you get to the point where if you started to put a slide up, people would scratch their heads and say at Amazon, well, what are you doing? Let's end this meeting and go start writing a narrative.
Right. I like that concept, because I think that PowerPoint can be a great tool for persuasion or for informing people of what you want them to know, because you can communicate some of it verbally, some of it visually. You can add the chart, you can add sometimes simple imagery, and all this can make for a very impactful presentation. But if you're trying to analyze a business concept, it's probably not the best tool because the information density is very low. Uh, I can go through about up to 200 slides in a 45, 50-minute keynote. So clearly there is almost no information on each slide because it's not quite moving like a movie, but it's moving very quickly. People always say, hey, can I get a copy of that deck? And I'm more than happy to give them a copy of the deck, but they're not going to be able to drive much from it later on. Maybe if they saw the presentation, maybe it'll bring back some of the ideas, but there's no way they could share that with a colleague and have the colleague get anything out of it.
Yeah, and that's just another thing with a written narrative. You have a record. If you're not at the meeting, you can read the narrative and the comments and the questions and the answers to those questions inside the document, because now it's a collaborative document, and get a very good idea of what the decision was made. Whereas if you walk away from a presentation, people tend to remember the parts that they like, or the parts that they didn't like, the extremes, and they walk away with a slightly different idea of what was said. But yeah, so it's a good tool for some cases, but it's not for Amazon for decision making.
Something that I talk about a lot is Amazon's focus on reducing customer effort, making the customer experience as frictionless as possible. And I do this from an outsider's perspective. I mean, I talk about things like one-click ordering and some of the other frustration-free packaging and so on. And I quote Jeff Bezos as saying that when you reduce friction, make something easier, people do more of it. But I'm really curious that's an outsider perspective. I'm really observing what I've seen from an insider perspective. Talk a little bit about that and what both Jeff and the Amazon culture in general felt about customer experience and in particular reducing effort.
Yeah. So, funny thing about one click is when it first launched, it was literally one click and you ordered, and people didn't know they ordered. So there was a message we had to put in afterwards that said, yes, it really was that simple. Your order is on its way. So Amazon's flywheel is really all about which are the things that drive the business and drive the growth of the business. A good chunk of the flywheel is lowering the price structure, adding selection to the catalog, and then convenience. Part of convenience is the click to deliver time, when you click on an order and by the time it gets to your house. But also part of it is being able to find and discover products that you may want to buy. And all of that is removing friction in that later part. And so all of the features, we knew we were inventing a new paradigm for how commerce was being done. And, you could take technology and do a lot of things in a much easier way than had been done before. So products could find, an unlimited number of products could find you, for instance, based on your browsing history, purchase history, what other people are doing. And so we tried to make those things that we thought you would want come to you versus you going to find them. So that's one example of removing friction. Another example is really with returns. And the way returns processes have been set up at most companies, where it's a hard process. It has a lot of friction, and that friction is deliberate. It's deliberate to prevent people from defrauding the company. And what we looked at with our returns process, we thought, well, the vast majority of our customers are trying to do the right thing, and they're trying to return something most often because we made a mistake. And so let's make it easy for them to return the product. When they say they're going to return it, we'll give them a label, and we'll offer the refund once it's on its way. And then for the very small percentage of the people who are trying to either defraud the company or skirt the system, we can detect that later. So don't penalize 99.5% of your customers who are trying to do the right thing to save the 0.5% of the customers who are trying to defraud you. And make no mistake, Amazon will detect that bad behavior for that very small group of people and deal with it appropriately, but not at the expense in the friction in the system for the rest of the Amazon's customers doing the right thing.
Yeah, you summarized about half a dozen of my slides right there because I spent years in the mail order business myself and pretty much changed businesses just as e-commerce was taking off or beginning to take off. But I can verify that returns are really a horrible thing from the standpoint of the company because they're very expensive. Often the product itself is unsaleable if you get it back. It's inconvenient. It takes customer service time, awkward for the customer. So most companies actually do, as you say, try and discourage returns. I recall when some companies would ship product in packaging that got destroyed so that it added additional friction. If you wanted to ship that product back to them, the customer would have to go find something to put it in. And if it was something awkward in shape, like maybe an old-fashioned record album, uh, then yeah, that was really a difficult thing. And people just say, I'll keep it, it's okay. So, I mean, that to me is a pretty remarkable thing for a direct marketing company to do. But obviously, it's paid huge dividends for Amazon.
Yeah, and the frustration-free packaging, it's that's a lot of those clamshell plastic things are really meant to prevent theft in stores. And I don't know about you, but whenever I open one of those things, probably it's about a 50% injury rate for me by
Yeah.
trying to get them open, where I get a big gash in my hand when I'm trying to open it. And so, we realized, well, this packaging is it's not for the customer. So we tried to change it. How can we make, customer obsessed packaging where it's when they get it, it's easy to open and use. There's no risk of injury. And when you get your flashlight and you're trying to open it up out of that clamshell packaging.
Yeah. Recently, I just I have a pair of shears, like kitchen shears, that I use to open those things with, and it minimizes injury risk, doesn't eliminate it. But I wore those out and got a new pair from a very nice German cutlery manufacturer. So really quality stuff. Believe it or not, they came in one of these heat-sealed clamshells. Not only that, they were secured to the clamshell by literally an industrial strength cable tie. I had to go to the garage and get wire cutters to get that thing out of the package, which I thought was rather ironic. But I mean, unfortunately, it's pretty typical, and it's such an important concept. But so many companies don't get it. They think, well, it's no big deal. I mean, I open those things all the time. The CEO probably has somebody that opens those things for him if he ever gets one.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, one of the interesting concepts is in the book is single-threaded leadership. And that isn't really obvious. I think many companies think of a skilled manager as being able to handle multiple responsibilities. I mean, that's sort of what makes them a good manager. They can keep a lot of balls in the air and not have any of them drop. Why is single-threaded leadership important, and how did Amazon achieve that?
Well, it took a while for Amazon to achieve it, but why I'll get to that in a second. But why it's important is if that something is big enough to be worth doing, you do want someone who wakes up every day when it's their sole job to figure out how can I create this product or value for customers, and just be immersed in that customer experience. And same thing with their team. You'll come up with something quicker and actually you most often higher quality than you would if it's your part-time job. So Dave Limp, who's the SVP of devices, has a great quote where he says the best way to fail at inventing something is to make it someone's part-time job. And so the way Amazon develops products by starting in services, you start from the customer experience and then work backwards from that. You have to really get deeply immersed into what is the experience I'm trying to create. And that's hard to do when you're context shifting to something very different. And especially if what you're trying to create is a small business right now, it may be very large in the future, but it will always suffer. It'll be number 4 or 5 on your priority list if you're also running some very large businesses on the side. So even for senior executives, and many times Amazon has taken very senior executives from large businesses and put them on a non-existent business and said, can you go create this? And that would be a career breaker at some companies. And a few examples are with digital. They took Steve Kessel, who was running the physical books, music, and video business, which was 77% of Amazon's business when he switched to go figure out how to do digital. We didn't really know this. We were going to build a Kindle at this point. We didn't know if we would do music first or video. But it was Steve moving from one of the biggest jobs at Amazon, along with Bill Carr, my author, to a group that, a handful of people saying, now you need to go figure out digital. And that actually took about a year and a half, 2 years to go figure out what the components we needed to build. That would not have happened if Steve and Bill also had to run this very large cash cow for Amazon. So that's just an example of a single threaded leader. How you get there, you have to have you have to have two things. You have to have a technology infrastructure that allows you to separate these things, and you don't have to go into too much detail there. You have to deliberately set that up, and if you see dependencies, you need to remove them. But the second thing is you need to teach people how to be autonomous and take control of their own destiny. And in some organizations, if they're used to being told by someone else, here's what you should do next, or you present your plan, I'm going to go review everything and I'm going to tweak it and make sure it's right. And it's not really your plan. You have to give people and teach them how they can be autonomous and run on their own. And then finally make sure that the person who's working on that opportunity has the skill sets and experience sets, is commensurate with the opportunity at hand. You can't have a junior product manager, for instance, start Amazon's digital business, which would become Kindle, Prime Video, and Prime Music. You had to have someone like a Steve Kessel and a Bill Carr who knew what success looked like. You had to have someone like Andy Jassy when he went over to web services. That there was no revenue there, but he then created this cloud. He created cloud computing, didn't even exist then. So he and his team created the cloud computing industry. But Andy had just left as Jeff's shadow. And he could have had any job in the company he wanted to, but he went to this experimental thing that had a high chance of failing, but created cloud computing. But he was a single-threaded leader on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that exemplifies a few things. That first of all, in many companies, the path to personal success, be that higher compensation or higher status in the company, is sort of moving up the hierarchy, making your boss look good. Not taking any big risks, because generally you're going to be changing jobs often enough that you won't, whatever you work on is going to have limited impact right now. It might impact the next person in the job even more than it impacts things while you're there. Where this is the total opposite. And think of it at, say, a major automaker, say, well, okay, we've got this person who is the global VP of manufacturing. We're going to tell this person now to go figure out electric vehicles, because we know that electric is going to be important in the future. That just doesn't happen. And what you would have, no doubt, is the CEO assigning the job of figuring out electric vehicles to somebody who would then pass that down until ultimately you had a specialist electric person on that project, which of course doesn't give it the heft or the visibility or the potency in the organization. So it's really a huge takeaway.
And compensation is also very important there. Amazon is long-term equity focused, but if you ask someone to do something, but pay them to do something else, if their bonus is based on revenue from the existing car division that they're running and not electric cars, they're going to focus typically on, okay, you're paying me to do this, and you've asked me to do this, but I'm just going to treat it as a part-time job, because actions and payment, compensation will typically win the day out of good intentions.
Colin, I think that a very common tendency at most companies is, when they're looking for new ventures, is to try and build on existing skills. Like, okay, we know how to do this pretty well, so how can we extend that to some other space? Or we have this capability, we have this kind of knowledge, whatever, how can we extend this? And this gets into the title of your book and the concept of working backwards, and also the future press release idea. Explain how that works.
Yeah, so the skills forward approach that you described is what a lot of companies do. They look at what we are good at, and how can we nudge into a market, a SWOT analysis, what our what our competitors are doing. But what's often not mentioned is the word customer. And so this is where Amazon faced the same problem that all organizations face. How do you take an idea, vet it, and bring it to market? But tried something radically different. And it also was an experiment. And we tried it and it started working so well that it just spread out through the rest of the company. And it was with the working backwards process. It's the name title of our book, but it's also a very specific process at Amazon on how Amazon takes an idea, no matter how small or large, and decides whether to bring it to market or not. So it can work for a feature on the phone app or a web page, or should create this thing called cloud computing. So it runs. It's a scalable process and has this fractal quality too. But at its heart, it's really starting from the customer experience and then working backwards from that. Sounds easy, but it's actually it's quite hard, and it takes many iterations. So the working backwards process, it's an iterative process. And the tool that you use is a PR FAQ document. So it's a written document, a press release, and an FAQ. So the very first thing you have to do is you have to write a press release about what is the customer problem I'm trying to solve, what is the solution, and why is it good for the customer. And you write that, and if you're not ready to go out and buy that product or use that feature, you don't move to the next step. And a lot of people want to work on something, or, hey, let's build this because we know how to do this. But at Amazon, we really made sure that we were focused on what is the customer problem we are trying to solve. And then the second part is, after you write a few versions of the press release, you also have a FAQ document, and there's broken up into an external and an internal FAQ. So the external FAQ are questions and answers that you'll ask and answer to the press or to customers. How much is this product going to cost me? Why should I use this versus what's out there on the market? How, if I change my behavior and use this service, how is it going to make my life better? So those are types of external facts, and you really have to go through in detail, explain that. And that, again, is challenging. If you don't crisply define your problem and you can't convince the customer, then you rewrite that. The internal FAQs are all of the tough problems that you are going to have to solve as an organization, and how you have to organize in order to go solve them. There could be unsolved technical issues that you need. You don't know how to bring it to market yet. What is the, so are we going to use a direct or partner sales force? How are we going to build this product with a bill of materials under $150 with these sets of features? And when you're going through this process, you realize, and the process tells you what skills the company needs to acquire in order to develop this solution, versus the company saying, what skills do I have, therefore what can I build? And those are two very different paths. And so with the digital path for Amazon, we were not a device maker, and we started going through this process and realized that in order to build a great e-reader, we needed to control that device, because that's where a lot of the innovation was going to happen. We didn't want to outsource that. And we also wanted to control the customer experience there. And so, pretty quickly we realized that, hey, if we're going to go into this digital space, we're going to remember, 77% of our business was physical media, and we knew a bunch of that was going away. So we said, if we're going to cannibalize this business, someone's going to cannibalize it. If it's going to be us, we need to learn how to build devices. And we had never done that before, and we had to it took a number of years to essentially get that capability. And not only turned into Kindles, but now you look at Alexa devices, Ring doorbells, and it really proliferated. But that is something you wouldn't get with a skills forward approach versus a working backwards approach. Is to do the process tells you what you need to do in order to solve a customer problem, versus the other way around.
How did Amazon test some of those market assumptions? I'll recall one market that I was involved in very early on was home automation, which now, as a result of efforts by Amazon and Google and a few others, is actually becoming a real thing that normal people are using. But this started like way back in the late 80s and early 90s, where some big brands, small companies were all piling into the home automation market, basically because this networking technology and control technology existed. And they said, wow, we can apply this to automating homes. People can turn their lights on and off, their appliances on and off. And they had this laundry list of things that people could do, but clearly they didn't take this press release approach very seriously because nobody ever looked to see, okay, how are we going to present this to the average homeowner? What's this thing going to cost them? And what are the true benefits that they want from it? And at that time, the answer was it's going to be super expensive, $10,000 or $20,000 for a home, which you might be able to, at that point, put in a swimming pool or an extra bedroom for, and they're going to be able to turn some lights on and off, and you're not going to see anything, and it's all going to be buried in the walls. And so, nobody really did that kind of examination. They got so caught up with, wow, this is what we can do. How does or did Amazon test whether the market really would behave the way that they expected it to?
Well, so, if Amazon, what I can tell you what Amazon typically doesn't do for something like this for a brand new, if you had sent a survey saying, do you want a hockey puck or a cylinder in your house that you can talk to and will answer you and order groceries, or they wouldn't know what to do with that, first of all. Or if you said, what type of hockey puck do you want in your kitchen? So market research, when you're trying to create something brand new, Amazon doesn't do a ton of that. And Amazon takes a different approach, which is the working backwards approach, which is what are real customer problems that we can or should solve. And we may or may not have the capabilities to solve them. And then you take a look at the total addressable market. So the second part is this a big enough problem? Does it affect enough customers to be worthy of devoting resources to go try to solve this, to make customers' lives better? Because most of these ideas, they're actually pretty good ideas. It's pretty easy to discard the duds and the awful ideas at the beginning of the process. It's where, hey, this is a good idea. I'm not really sure what it is, but can we make it into a product that we can build that customers will buy? That's the tricky part and the secret sauce. But you really just have to go down to the next level and deeply immerse yourself in the customer experience. And would you use this on your own? Part of it is, would I pay $20,000 to have a doorbell that can see people walk by? Well, no, I wouldn't do that. But would I pay $200? Yeah. And so, that kind of then forces people to figure out, okay, if we're going to do this, we need to have a device that has these capabilities and this type of networking available in the house. So, and bandwidth. So with digital, for instance, we were looking at the digital before we invented Kindle, but we realized, the screen technology wasn't there, the internet bandwidth wasn't there, so it was a little too early. And that's part of the working backwards process too, is now the right time to do it, and is it big enough? But the customer research things, especially when you're creating something brand new, doing things like surveys and focus groups, those should be tools that are meant more to reaffirm your hypotheses versus having them generate what you're going to build next. And so Amazon works a different way than a lot of companies in that respect, but it really, because it pivots on understanding the customer experience.
Right. And I think to extend your example to home automation, was there a pain point there that was going to address? And the answer was the pain points weren't that big. The engineers designing this stuff loved the idea of being able to sit in one room and control lights around the house and have them go on and off according to program. But that wasn't addressing a pain point for most consumers. It just, it's like, oh, that'd be nice, maybe. And it was way too complicated for the vast majority too.
Yeah.
So, Colin, this has been fascinating. How can people find you and your ideas?
So we have a website called workingbackwards.com, and it explains a little bit about what we do and the process. So my colleague Bill Carr and we advise companies on what this Amazon advances in management science are. And, should they decide to implement one or more of these in their own organization, we coach and advise CEOs and executive teams on how to implement these principles and processes in your own organization. So workingbackwards.com is the best way to get an initial take at what we have going on.
Great. Well, we will link there to the book and any other resources we spoke about on the show notes page at rogerdooley.com/podcast. We'll have audio, video, and text versions of this conversation there as well. Colin, thanks for being on the show.
Oh, thank you for inviting me, Roger. This is a great conversation.